We're doing a section on the Network Plus called Network Policies. And what we're going to be studying today is about the policies in which usually companies implement in order to protect the network. Because a lot of policies talk about that. They talk about a lot of protecting the network. What kind of security procedures should we take? What kind of procedures does this need? What kind of procedures does that need, basically? So it's a lot of procedures, it's a lot of policies, it's a lot of security. Alright, so let's dive into this. And let's start off with talking about IT governance. IT governance is used to provide a comprehensive security management framework for the organization. This involves policies, standards, baselines, guidance, and procedures. So what is a policy? Policies defines the role of security inside an organization. So it defines the role of security inside the organization and establishes the desired end state for the security program. Now, do keep in mind, I'm learning this as well. I wouldn't really say that I'm super qualified to teach it, but we are reviewing, so let's get into this. So just to repeat, a policy defines the role of security. So it defines the role of security inside an organization and establishes the desired end state for the security program. So included in a policy is organizational, system-specific, and issue-specific. So let's talk about organizational. It provides a framework to meet business goals and defines the roles, responsibilities, and terms associated with it. System-specific addresses the security of a specific technology, application, network, or computer system. So we're kind of addressing specific security measures that we essentially need to take in order to protect certain things. Issue specific, we have addresses. It addresses a specific security issue, such as email, employee termination procedures, or other specific issues. What is a standard? Implements a policy in an organization. What is a baseline? Creates a reference point in network architecture and design, so it's just a reference point. What is a guideline? Recommended action that allows for exceptions and allowance in unique situations. Let's reread that. Recommended action. So it's a recommended action that allows for exceptions and allowances in a unique situation. Okay, that's weird. Procedure. It's a detailed step-by-step instructions created to ensure personnel can perform a given task or series of action. That makes more sense. Plans and procedures. So let's talk about some of the plans and procedures. Change management. Structured way of changing the state of a computer system, network, or IT procedure. Make sure risks are considered prior to making a change. So we're going to plan, we're going to approve, and we're going to document. So what is an incident response plan? It contains instructions to help network and system administrators detect, respond to, and recover from network security incidents. What's involved in this? What's involved in a incident response plan is preparation, identification. We're basically identifying what needs to be changed, containment, eradication, what needs to be getting rid of, recovery, and the lessons learned. So what did we learn from this situation? What did we learn from the incident that happened recently? Maybe it was a flood that happened in an organization, and they realized that they need to move it to a cloud database. That way they don't lose their systems, even if some sort of nature-like incident happens to them. So now they learn from that. So then there's the disaster recovery plan, documents on how an organization can quickly resume work after an unplanned incident. Business continuity plan outlines how a business will continue operating during an unplanned disruption. And give me 1 second, because okay, yeah, I did mute YouTube. I was afraid I didn't mute YouTube, and sometimes they can be really loud. Business continuity plan outlines how a business will continue operating during an unplanned. A disaster recovery plan will be referenced from a business continuity plan. System lifecycle plan describes the approach to maintain an asset from the creation of disposal. So what's involved in planning? Involved in planning involves the planning and requirement analysis for a given system, including architecture outlining and risk identification. So planning involves the planning, basically, of how you're going to implement the change. Now, there is also requirement analysis. What is required in order to implement the change? And that's involved in planning, of course. Then there is the design feature. It outlines the new systems, including the possible interconnections, technologies to use, and how it should be implemented. Then there's the transition. Basically, how is everything going to be transitioned? How are we going to get used to this transition? And then there's the operations, which includes the daily running of assets, as well as updating, patching, and fixing issues that may occur. Because we're basically, what this whole CompTIA Network Plus is about is being network engineers. So as network engineers, we have to be ready to be able to fix computer issues depending on the organization we're working for. So if we're working for an organization and we're responsible for 2 floors of computers, we got to study and make sure we're prepared for any issues that arise. And that's where this is what they mean by operations that may happen. And then there's retirement. And that means, what is the life cycle of the computers? What is the life cycle? How long do you think they're going to last before we need to make another change? And then there's the standard operating procedure. And those of you who just now entered, we're talking about a disaster recovery plan. Right now, we're kind of on the topic of that, and we just now changed on to standard operating procedure. And what that is a set of step-by-step instructions compiled by an organization to help its employees carry out a routine operation. And that's what your standard operating plan is. It really just depends on what job the person is doing, of course. But that would be what your standard operating procedure would be. I'm sure every organization has them. If they're a good organization anyways. Hardening and security policies. So what hardening means is basically making your computer so that it can't have any security breaches or getting any viruses, and what's involved with prevention. It's like preventing security issues or viruses and everything under that kind of category. And then there's security policies, and what they mean by security policies is basically the same thing as hardening. I cannot say hardening whatsoever. But basically, as an example, as a security policy would be a password policy, meaning that the employees within the organization, to keep the computers from being damaged, you would tell them, hey, you need to have a good password to prevent it from getting maybe brute force attacked or dictionary attacked. And those of you who don't know what that is, we talked about it in the last section. Basically what it means is whenever someone tries to hack your password on your computer, basically. And that's why it's good to have those long with mixed numbers, mixed special symbol passwords. That way they can't get into that. But let's talk about some of the different hardening and security policies that are on here. And the first one is password policy, which is what we just now talked about. It's basically just making a policy so that your passwords are good and not something easy to hack, like the name of your pet or your birthday or your home address, basically. So that's the first policy that we talk about by hardening our computers and security policy. The second one is acceptable use policy, and it is a set of rules that restricts the way in which a network resource may be used and sets guidelines on how it should be used. Now, this is if someone misuses it, basically, they get in trouble. That's how that usually works. Then there is bring your own device policy. So an acceptable use policy is basically their hardware. A bring your own device policy is your hardware. It allows employees to access enterprise networks and systems using their personal device. Create a segment network where the bring your own device can connect to. So basically create a separate network or subnet your network so that people with their own devices can connect to it and make it like an open network or something. Whereas the computers on on that they own, the company itself, they can just, let me think of, what was I trying to say? Basically, they can be on their separate network, which is probably more secure than someone who just brings their own device. Then there's remote access policy, a document which outlines and defines acceptable methods of remotely connected to the internal network, basically wirelessly internal access. Onboarding policy, a documented policy that describes all the requirements for integrating a new hire into the company and its cultures. Offboarding policy, a document policy that covers all the steps to successfully part ways with an employee who's leaving the company. There's a security policy, a document that outlines how to protect the organization's systems, networks, and data from threats. So basically, how are we going to protect that? How are we going to prevent it from getting hacked? Data loss prevention policy, a document defining how organizations can share and protect data. Data loss prevention policy minimizes accidental or malicious data loss. So how are you going to prevent from data getting lost? How are you going to, which obviously implies backups. Obviously, that's definitely going to be in there. Alright, so now we're going to get onto the agreements. And after... Let me see something. Common agreements. Let's see. Yeah. So this has actually been a pretty short lesson, but we're going to go ahead and cover it. So this is actually the last page is the agreements, but after I finish this lesson, we're going to just stop the stream. And I'm going to study some flashcards, and then after that, I'm going to move on to the next session. I usually do about 4 sections a day. Just keep an eye out on my channel, and we will continue to study. Right now, we're on common agreements, so let's go ahead and cover that. And then after that, I will do a little summary of what we covered. So, common agreements. The first one is NDA, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of NDAs, especially in the gaming industry, because a lot of people in the gaming industry have to sign an NDA saying basically I'm not going to show this information to people in the public because it's confidential. And I actually had a friend that I worked with not too long ago, and he had to sign NDAs because he was working for a so-and-so company. I'm not going to say who. But yeah, and I thought that was pretty cool, because I never did know what an NDA was until I started talking to him. I'm like, what's an NDA? Are you talking about? But what NDA stands for is non-disclosure agreement. And what it does is it defines what data is confidential and cannot be shared outside of that relationship. So basically, you cannot share it outside of your work. And depending on who you're allowed to share it to at work. A non-disclosure agreement is an administrative administrative control. It includes fines, forfeiture of rights, and jail time if you share it, basically. Next is the Memorandum of Understanding Agreement. It's MOU for its abbreviation. It's a non-binding agreement between 2 or more organizations to detail what common actions they intend to take, often referred to as a letter of intent. It's basically like, I understand what we're doing here, and I agree to it. And usually used internally between two businesses, basically. And the last agreement is an SLA, service level agreement. It documents the quality, availability, responsibility agreed upon by a service provider and a client. Now let's go to the top here, and we'll talk about what we went over. So we talked about the IT governance, which is basically made of policies, standards, baselines, guidelines, and procedures. We talked about policies and how they basically define rules of security inside an organization. We talked about an organizational, which provides a framework for how businesses meet their goals. We talked about system specific, which basically addresses the security of specific applications, specific systems, etc. Anything that involves security or anything that could potentially be, I guess what I'm trying to say is, be threatened by a security breach, that's issue specific. And then we talked about standards, which is basically policies. We talked about baselines, which is reference points in a network or architecture. Sorry about that. We talked about guidelines, which is recommended actions, basically depending on what the situation is. Procedures, step-by-step actions that you should take depending on what you're doing. Plans and procedures, and this includes change management when you're making a change to something. Incident response plan, how you should respond if there is an incident. Disaster recovery, how are we going to recover from a disaster, basically. And then we talked about hardening and security policies, which is where we just now talked about, which was the password policies, the acceptable use policy, bring your own device. I don't know who's yawning, but you better quit because it's making me yawn. But anyways, we talked about security policy, data loss prevention policy, and then I was actually wrong. There was another thing, and that was common agreements. And my phone just now went off. And the last thing, which was common agreements, I know I just now repeated that, was NDA, MOU, and the SLA. And that's going to wrap up this section. Thank you guys for joining, and I will be on later, so keep an eye out for me. And that's going to be it. So I'll see you guys in the next one.